Welcome back to our channel, where we explore the minds that shaped history. Before we dive into today's fascinating journey through the psychology of one of history's most complex figures, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the minds of historical legends. Today, we're stepping into the vast steppes of Mongolia to understand the man who built the largest contiguous empire in human history, Temujin, better known as Genghis Khan. But we're not just going to recount battles and conquests. We're going to explore what made this man tick, what drove him from an abandoned child to the most feared and respected leader of his time, and how his unique psychology shaped not just an empire, but the entire course of human civilization. Picture a young boy, perhaps 9 years old, watching his father die from poison administered by rival tribesmen. This boy, Temujin, born around 1162, suddenly found himself cast out with his mother and siblings, forced to survive on wild onions and marmots in the harsh Mongolian wilderness. This traumatic childhood would forge a psychology unlike any other, one built on survival, pragmatism, and an almost supernatural ability to understand human nature. When most children were learning traditional skills, Temujin was learning that loyalty could mean the difference between life and death, that trust was earned through action, not words, and that the world respected only strength backed by intelligence. What's fascinating about Genghis Khan's psychology is how his early trauma didn't break him, but instead created an incredibly adaptive mind. When his blood brother, Jamuka, betrayed him, when his own tribe abandoned his family, when he was captured and enslaved with a wooden collar around his neck, each of these experiences added another layer to his psychological armor. He developed what modern psychologists might call a growth mindset, centuries before the term existed. Every setback became a lesson, every betrayal a masterclass in human behavior, every victory a stepping stone to something greater. The genius of Genghis Khan lay not in his brutality, though history certainly remembers that aspect, but in his revolutionary thinking about society, merit, and human potential. In a world dominated by rigid hereditary hierarchies, he created a meritocracy where a shepherd could become a general if he proved his worth. This wasn't just military strategy. It was a profound psychological insight into human motivation. He understood that people fight harder for leaders who value their contributions regardless of their birth. His army wasn't just fighting for conquest. They were fighting for a system that gave them unprecedented opportunity. Consider his approach to religious tolerance. In the 13th century, when religious wars were tearing apart civilizations, Genghis Khan protected all faiths equally. This wasn't born from some modern sensibility, but from a deeply practical psychology. He recognized that spiritual beliefs were powerful motivators, and that attempting to suppress them would create endless resistance. Instead, he co-opted religious leaders, protected holy men of all faiths, and even sought their wisdom. This psychological flexibility allowed him to rule diverse populations without the constant rebellions that plagued other empires. His military innovations reveal a mind that thought in systems rather than single solutions. The decimal system he used to organize his army, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, wasn't just organizational brilliance. It was psychological engineering. Every soldier knew exactly where they fit, who they reported to, and how their actions contributed to the whole. He created a sense of belonging and purpose that transformed nomadic horsemen into the most disciplined military force of their era. The psychological safety within units, where soldiers were forbidden to abandon their companions under penalty of death, created bonds stronger than family ties. What truly sets Genghis Khan apart psychologically was his information network. He understood that knowledge was power long before that became a cliché. His vast spy network, his protection of merchants who brought news from distant lands, his insistence that his generals learn to read and write, all of this reveals a mind that valued intelligence over brute force. He would spend months studying an enemy's psychology, their fears, their desires, their internal conflicts before ever drawing a sword. When he did strike, it was with precise psychological warfare, spreading terror ahead of his armies to weaken resistance, but also spreading stories of mercy for those who surrendered, creating a powerful carrot and stick dynamic. The man who couldn't read created one of history's first international postal systems. The man who grew up in poverty established trade routes that connected East and West like never before. The man who watched his father murdered by poison created laws that protected merchants and ambassadors. Each of these decisions reveals a psychology shaped by deprivation, but not limited by it. He took his wounds and transformed them into wisdom, his weaknesses into strengths, his outsider status into the ultimate advantage. His relationship with knowledge and adaptation was remarkable. When he encountered Chinese siege weapons, he didn't just capture them, he studied them, improved them, and integrated Chinese engineers into his forces. When he found Islamic mathematicians, he put them to work improving his administration. This cognitive flexibility, this hunger for learning, this absence of cultural arrogance, these psychological traits allowed him to build an empire that stretched from sunrise to sunset. The legacy of Genghis Khan's psychology extends far beyond military conquest. His emphasis on written law, the yasa, created predictability in a chaotic world. His protection of trade routes sparked an unprecedented exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultures. His meritocratic ideals planted seeds that would eventually bloom into modern concepts of social mobility. Even his brutality, terrible as it was, followed a psychological logic: swift, overwhelming force to prevent prolonged conflict, making examples of resistant cities to encourage others to surrender peacefully. Understanding Genghis Khan means understanding a man who turned psychological trauma into strategic thinking, who transformed abandonment into self-reliance, who converted betrayal into an encyclopedic knowledge of human nature. He wasn't just a conqueror. He was a psychologist before psychology existed, a sociologist before sociology was named, a systems thinker in an age of linear thinking. His empire fell apart within generations, but his psychological innovations, meritocracy, religious tolerance, international trade, written law applying equally to all, these ideas conquered the world more thoroughly than his armies ever could. Today, 800 years later, genetic studies suggest that 16 million men carry his Y chromosome. But his true legacy lies in the psychological revolution he initiated. He showed that birth doesn't determine worth, that diversity can be strength, that knowledge from any source has value, that systems thinking can overcome traditional limitations. Whether we admire or abhor him, we cannot deny that Genghis Khan's unique psychology changed the trajectory of human civilization forever, proving that one mind, shaped by hardship but not broken by it, can indeed reshape the world. The psychological transformation that occurred within Temujin as he became Genghis Khan reveals itself most clearly in his approach to warfare itself. Unlike traditional steppe warriors who fought for glory or immediate plunder, his military campaigns were psychological operations designed to reshape entire civilizations. Consider his siege of Zhongdu, modern Beijing, in 1211. Rather than simply attacking, he first spent months studying Chinese siege warfare, recruiting Chinese engineers, and most importantly, understanding the psychological pressure points of urban populations. He recognized that cities, unlike nomadic tribes, depended on complex supply chains and social hierarchies that could be disrupted through calculated psychological warfare. His armies would allow refugees to flee besieged cities, not from mercy, but because he understood that streams of terrified civilians spreading tales of Mongol invincibility were worth more than any battering ram. This wasn't brutality for its own sake. It was a carefully calibrated psychological strategy that turned fear into a weapon more powerful than any sword. What makes his psychology particularly fascinating is how he processed betrayal and loyalty. Where most leaders of his era would execute traitors immediately, Genghis Khan often recruited them, understanding that a person who betrayed one master might serve another faithfully if properly motivated. Yet he showed no mercy to those who betrayed their own blood relatives, revealing a complex moral framework rooted in his traumatic childhood. When Jamuka, his blood brother turned rival, was finally captured, Genghis Khan offered him a position in his empire. When Jamuka refused and requested death, the Khan granted him a noble execution without spilling blood, honoring their childhood bond even in enmity. This ability to compartmentalize personal feelings from strategic necessity while still maintaining deep emotional connections shows a psychological sophistication that contradicts the simple barbarian narrative often associated with him. His relationship with knowledge and learning presents another psychological paradox. Here was an illiterate man who couldn't read any language, yet he became history's greatest patron of literacy and scholarship. He recruited scribes from every conquered nation, established libraries, and mandated that all his generals learn to read. This wasn't mere pragmatism. It revealed a deep psychological hunger for understanding that transcended his own limitations. He would spend hours listening to Chinese philosophers, Islamic mathematicians, and Christian theologians debate, not to choose one truth over another, but to synthesize all knowledge into a comprehensive worldview. His famous religious tolerance wasn't born from indifference, but from a psychological framework that saw all religions as different paths to understanding the eternal blue sky he worshipped. He exempted religious leaders from taxation, not because he was generous, but because he genuinely believed that their prayers, regardless of which god they addressed, contributed to his empire's cosmic mandate. The most revealing aspect of his psychology emerges in his treatment of women, revolutionary for his time and culture. While other conquerors saw women as property, Genghis Khan appointed them as advisors, regents, and even military commanders. His daughters didn't receive dowries. Instead, they received kingdoms to rule. This wasn't progressive ideology, but practical psychology. Having been raised by a strong mother who held his family together after his father's death, he understood that competence transcended gender. His wife Borta remained his primary advisor throughout his life, and he publicly acknowledged her counsel in matters of state. When she was kidnapped early in their marriage and returned pregnant with another man's child, he raised the boy as his own without question, showing a psychological security that defied the honor-obsessed culture of his time. His approach to succession planning reveals perhaps the deepest layers of his psychological makeup. Unlike most conquerors who either named their favorite son as heir or let them fight it out after their death, Genghis Khan spent years psychologically profiling each of his sons, understanding their strengths and weaknesses with clinical precision. He knew Joki was capable, but carried the stigma of questionable parentage. He recognized that Chagatai was brave, but too rigid in thinking. He saw that Ogedai was intelligent and diplomatic, but prone to alcoholism. And he understood that Tolui was brilliant militarily, but lacked political acumen. Instead of choosing based on tradition or favoritism, he structured his succession to maximize each son's strengths while minimizing their weaknesses, appointing Ogedai as Supreme Khan while giving each brother territories that suited their capabilities. This level of psychological assessment and strategic planning for events after his own death shows a mind capable of transcending ego and mortality. The economic psychology of Genghis Khan deserves special attention. He understood that wealth wasn't gold in vaults, but circulation of goods and ideas. His establishment of the Silk Road's golden age wasn't about taxation, but about creating psychological incentives for trade. Merchants received special passports providing protection throughout the empire. He standardized weights and measures across cultures that had never previously interacted. He created the first international postal system, understanding that information flow was the nervous system of empire. His economic policies revealed a psychological understanding that prosperity bred loyalty more effectively than fear. Cities that surrendered peacefully received tax breaks and trading privileges, while those that resisted faced economic isolation even after conquest. This carrot and stick approach showed sophisticated understanding of behavioral psychology centuries before such concepts were formalized. Perhaps most remarkably, his psychological impact extended to environmental consciousness. He designated vast areas as protected hunting grounds, not for conservation in the modern sense, but because he understood the psychological importance of maintaining connections to traditional ways of life. He prohibited bathing in rivers during spring to protect spawning fish, showing an understanding of natural cycles that many agricultural civilizations had forgotten. These laws weren't arbitrary, but reflected a psychological framework that saw humans as part of nature rather than separate from it, a worldview that would influence Ondiui environmental thinking in Asia for centuries to come. The psychological transformation that occurred within Genghis Khan's empire reveals perhaps the most fascinating aspect of his mental framework, his to create what modern psychologists would recognize as a collective identity that transcended traditional boundaries. This wasn't merely political unification, but a profound psychological revolution that reshaped how millions of people understood themselves and their place in the world. Consider the psychological impact on a Chinese engineer who found himself working alongside a Persian mathematician and an Arab astronomer in the Khan's court. These individuals, who would have never met under normal circumstances, were now part of something larger than their original identities. The Khan understood that human psychology craves belonging, and he masterfully created a new form of belonging that wasn't based on blood or birthplace, but on merit and loyalty to the empire's vision. His approach to psychological warfare extended far beyond the battlefield into the realm of cultural memory and collective consciousness. He deliberately cultivated contradictory narratives about himself, allowing some regions to see him as a liberator while others viewed him as a destroyer. This wasn't confusion, but calculated psychological strategy. He understood that different populations responded to different psychological triggers, and he tailored his image accordingly. In cities that surrendered peacefully, he presented himself as a protector of commerce and learning. In regions that resisted, he became the embodiment of divine punishment. This psychological flexibility shows a sophisticated understanding of how fear and hope could be wielded as tools of empire building. The Khan's personal psychology was shaped by profound contradictions that would have destroyed a less resilient mind. He was simultaneously a destroyer of cities and a protector of artisans, a killer of millions and a champion of religious freedom, a nomadic warrior and a patron of urban civilization. These contradictions weren't weaknesses, but sources of psychological strength. Modern psychology tells us that the ability to hold contradictory ideas simultaneously is a mark of cognitive sophistication, and Genghis Khan exemplified this trait. He could order the complete destruction of a city one day and spend the next day carefully preserving its libraries and recruiting its scholars. This psychological complexity allowed him to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances without losing his core identity. His understanding of human motivation was remarkably sophisticated for his time. He recognized that people were driven by multiple needs: security, status, wealth, knowledge, and meaning. His system addressed all these needs simultaneously. Warriors could gain status through conquest. Merchants could accumulate wealth through protected trade routes. Scholars could pursue knowledge in his libraries, and religious seekers could practice their faith freely. This multi-layered approach to human psychology created a remarkably stable empire despite its vast diversity. He understood that satisfied psychological needs create loyalty more effectively than fear alone ever could. The psychological impact of his religious tolerance deserves special attention. In an age when religious identity was often the primary source of meaning and community, his policy of absolute religious freedom was psychologically revolutionary. He didn't just tolerate different religions. He actively sought to understand them, often engaging religious leaders in philosophical discussions. This wasn't mere political calculation, but reflected his genuine psychological curiosity about different ways of understanding existence. He exempted religious leaders from taxation, not just to win their support, but because he recognized their psychological importance to their communities. This understanding of religion's psychological function was centuries ahead of its time. His approach to succession planning reveals another fascinating aspect of his psychology. Unlike many conquerors who couldn't imagine the world continuing without them, Genghis Khan spent considerable time preparing for his death. He understood the psychology of power transitions and created elaborate rituals and systems to ensure continuity. He divided his empire among his sons not randomly, but based on careful psychological assessment of their personalities and capabilities. He understood that different types of leadership were needed for different regions and matched his successors to their psychological strengths. This forward-thinking approach shows a leader who understood that true greatness lay not